Now, we've been looking at the criminal conspiracy. Supposing it is just a loner,
Yes.
then again, how could people watching this programme help identify that man?
If it is a loner, I mean, it could explain the apparent motivelessness of the crime, but maybe this person has a fixation or a strong fascination with Jill Dando. Maybe he's displayed that in some way with collection of photographs, constant talking. I'm not sure, but people need to look again to their partners or others. Was he concerned or fascinated by Jill Dando? What was he doing on Monday the 26th of April? Was he late for work? Did he not turn up for work? Was there some features of his behaviour which was different on that day?
So in May 1999, on the Crime Watch reconstruction and appeal to the Jill Dando murder, Hamish Campbell asked the question, if it was a loner, what was he doing on that day? Was there any features about his behaviour that stood out? So let's look to see what Barry George was doing on the day Jill Dando was murdered. So the icon on the far right is where Barry George lives. The icon next to that is Jill Dando. The red icon is a taxi office, and the orange icon is a building called Hafad.
On the same day, George had visited a local advice centre known as Hafad. 2 days later, he went back, trying to establish what time he'd been there. He did the same with London Traffic Cars, a cab company he'd also been at on the day of the murder.
For Hafad, Hammersmith and Fulham Action on Disability. On arrival, he was told no one would see him without an appointment, something he would have known.
As well as coming here to Hafad, Barry George also visited the offices of a local taxi firm and a charity. His manner in each was described as anxious, but 2 days later he was back, apparently trying to get them to agree that he visited them earlier than he really did.
So there was no CCTV, so the times are not precise. The workers at Hafad, who were actually the first people to call the police on Barry George, said he was there, I think, within 45 minutes of Jill Dando being murdered, but the times were not precise. Elaine Hutton of Hammersmith and Fulham Action for Disability, whose headquarters is 5 minutes walk from the end of Gowan Avenue, told the Old Bailey that George arrived at the centre at noon that day. She overheard a conversation between him and the welfare rights worker Susan Bicknell, in which he was quite agitated. It was Susan's first day at work, and I was monitoring the situation closely because I was aware I might have to step in and help. He came in with carrier bags full of papers, and he was dissatisfied about the services from the medical profession he had received. Susan was trying to stay calm and stay focused on the fact that she couldn't deal with him on that day and he needed to make an appointment. Miss Bicknell eventually managed to placate George, and he left 15 minutes after arriving. He made an appointment for the next day but failed to turn up. So half an hour after Jill Dando was murdered, Barry George randomly turns up at this disability centre making a fuss. They give him an appointment for the next day, but he doesn't show up. He turns up on the day after, which would be the 28th. He was again highly agitated, she said. He wanted to know the exact time he had been at Hafad on that Monday morning. I wasn't clear, but he wasn't going to go away with that answer, so I said about 11 o'clock. He made it quite clear he wasn't happy with that estimate and needed to know the exact time. George said the description of the man wanted by the police for the murder of Jill Dando fitted him, although it could have been anybody. He insisted he wanted to know the time of his visit on the Monday so he could give the information to his solicitor. So 2 days after the murder of Jill Dando, Barry George is trying to set up alibis, and he was worried that he fits the description of the man that shot Jill Dando. The thing about that is, the description hadn't even been released yet. Barry George was worried that he fit the description of the man that shot Jill Dando before the description had been released. 2 days before the description was being released. Barry George was worried on the 28th. The description wasn't released until the 30th of April. How did Barry George know that he fit the description of the man that shot Jill Dando if it hadn't been released by the police yet?
4 days after the murder of Jill Dando, the police released a computer-generated picture of the man who's being treated as a principal suspect. Police say new witnesses have already come forward since the murder. They are hoping this image will jog a few more memories. Paul Davis, ITN.
Barry George was seeking an alibi and was concerned that he looked like the suspect before the suspect e-fit was released because he made eye contact with Jill Dando's neighbour, Jeffrey Upfield.
I came out of the front door and I saw this man running down the street, and he immediately alerted my attention because he was furtive. He was up to no good. I could tell it at once.
He was in my sight for around 4 to 5 seconds. He started off running fast, but then heard my gate clicked. He looked in my direction, saw me and slowed down. He went behind the lorry parked in the road and I didn't see him again. He just didn't look right. He looked suspicious. Now for me, this is why Barry George was concerned that he looked like the man in the e-fit. And this is why half an hour after this, Barry George was seeking alibis. He thought he was seen by Jill Dando's neighbour. Now admittedly, the neighbour did not pick Barry George out at an ID parade, but I would say this: if this neighbour really got a good look at the man, why didn't the police ask him to compose an e-fit? I believe he glimpsed the person, they made eye contact, but as far as Barry George is concerned, his adrenaline's pumping. He's like, oh shit, I've been caught here. This is what Barry George thought. Barry George thought that Mr. Upfield was given the e-fit. He didn't know nothing about the bus stop man. He thought it was Mr. Upfield. Hence the reason, half an hour after this, he went to Hafad seeking an alibi, concerned he looked like the e-fit. 2 days before the e-fit had been released, mind you. Of course he was seeking an alibi. Of course he thought he looked like the e-fit, because he made eye contact with the neighbour. Just imagine that for a second. Someone's concerned that they fit the description of someone before the description has been released. So this map represents what I believed happened. So he shoots Jill Dando, he's witnessed by Mr. Upfield, he runs home, which is the red line, changes his clothes, picks up some stuff, puts a yellow jacket on, and the yellow line is him going back to Hafad. And for all the people that say, oh, he couldn't have done it, his IQ was too low, the people at Hafad are mental health care professionals. They were the first people to phone the police on Barry George. He was planting a false alibi. He wanted them to agree that he was there at a time that made it impossible for him to shoot Jill Dando. They were very suspicious when he started talking about solicitors and e-fits, and they called the police on him. Now just think about the timing on that day. If Barry George did shoot Jill Dando and he did make eye contact with the neighbour, of course he's going to be concerned that he looks like the e-fit, and of course he's going to want to find an alibi, and everything just ties in perfectly. It's like a 1.3 mile round trip. If he ran home, changed his clothes, then made his way to Hafad. Simple. Hafad was not a place that Barry George frequented a lot. I think he turned up there once in 1997. That was the only other time he'd been there, and around half an hour after Jill Dando's murder, he randomly turns up. They give him an appointment for the next day. He misses that appointment. He turns up the next day on the 28th, trying to confirm what time he was there on the 26th, saying he was concerned because he looks like the e-fit, but the e-fit hadn't been released yet.